We are in a section of the Gospel of Matthew dealing with the death of Jesus. We have covered his trial, his appearance before Caiaphas, his appearance before Pilate. We have Jesus now making his way to the cross and his crucifixion. We are looking at Matthew chapter 27. We're going to read one verse, and we are going to read from the New Testament for everyone. Matthew chapter 27, verse 32. As they were going out, they found a man from Cyrene called Simon. They forced him to carry his cross. In order to understand this verse, we need to review some basic New Testament understandings. We have to, as it were, go into some of the technical details and understand the history of the writing of the Gospels. The first point we want to make is that in the modern era, the conclusion has been drawn up that the first of the four Gospels to be written was Mark. Now, why is that case? So, I'm going to give you kind of the simple story. The reason why we believe that Mark was the first of the four Gospels to be written is the fact that when you look at the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, there's material that is common to both. If you, simple story, take the material that is common from Matthew and Luke, you can basically reconstruct the Gospel of Mark. More or less. There's a little bit that more than that. But basically, that is the case. So the modern theory of the gospel writings is this, that the gospel writers made use of sources. Mark being first off the block, and tradition says he was associated with Peter and used the memories of Peter as a basis. So he writes his gospel. Matthew and Luke, not writing together, but distinct and separate, have Mark as a basis in which to use and use the basic narrative of this. Now, to Mark's gospel, they have material that is unique to themselves. There's also a bit of material that is common to Matthew and Luke, which seems to be largely teaching materials. And this might have been oral material dealing with Jesus' teaching. John's gospel stands outside of the tradition of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are traditionally called synoptic gospels, which literally means with one eye. They have the same narrative, whereas John has a different structure and order and organization to his gospel. So when we come to a verse like Matthew chapter 27, verse 32, it helps if we can go back to the sources that Matthew used to see where he's coming from. In simple terms, who is Simon of Cyrene? Why is this person mentioned here? Well, if Matthew was using sources, including Mark's gospel, well, then we have a sense of where maybe he gets this from. If we go to Mark chapter 15 and verse 21, we find Simon is mentioned, but not only Simon is mentioned, but the fact that he had two sons. So Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross of Jesus, had two sons. Now, the other thing is, what we have said is that the Gospels were not written shortly after the death of Jesus. And the reason for this seems fairly simple. In the early church, there were numerous eyewitnesses to the life, teaching, death, and in that sense, ultimately resurrection of Jesus. Why would you have written records? Writing was expensive, time-consuming. You could only produce one document at a time. When you could turn and look at this person, that person, so on and so forth, and have a means to retell the story of Jesus from personal experience. It seems that the writing of the Gospels became necessary as the first generation of the church died off. Mark put pen to paper and wrote his story of Jesus. And as he looked at the story of Jesus' crucifixion, told the story of Simon and his two sons and how he took up the cross. And the question becomes, then why does Mark not only mention Simon, but the fact that he has two sons? Now, let's get into a bit of conjecture that seems to have a solid a base to it. And that is, if you look at another New Testament book, Romans chapter 16 and verse 13, reading from the New International Version, Paul says these words, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me." You see, Mark included the two sons in chapter 15 and verse 21 because they were known to the people in the church. It is quite possible and borders on the issue of probable that the Rufus mentioned in Romans 16 is the same Rufus as mentioned in Mark 15:21. And you see, if you take that connection, then all of a sudden it makes sense why Simon of Cyrene was mentioned in the carrying of the cross. That is why his name was remembered and recorded decades later, because he has a family heritage in the life of the church. And so that event has significance at the time of the writing of the Gospels. It was still important and significant. The question then becomes why Simon, who was from Cyrene, was in Jerusalem. Well, this has many possible answers. And I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive answers, but there are several answers we can give. Cyrene was an ancient city in North Africa, in the area of the modern country of Libya. The city of Cyrene had a substantial Jewish population at this time. Simon of Cyrene was more than likely a Jew in Jerusalem because of the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. He was on a pilgrimage when he was picked out of the crowd to carry the cross. That seems to be foundational. Because of the nature of the Jewish faith in the first century, it was expected that a Jewish male in particular was to spend time in Jerusalem for one of the great festivals, feasts. So that probably is the reason why Simon was there. But we don't have to say that was necessarily all of it. Simon also might have been a merchant. Now, let's take Simon and let's take something that's completely not relevant, or not so much relevant, related to him. But take Priscilla and Aquila, those two figures in the book of Acts that figure in the history of the early church who traveled extensively. They were merchants. So Priscilla and Aquila, as it were, could possibly perform for us the service as a model for Simon of Cyrene. If he was a merchant like Priscilla and Aquila, he might have, by nature of his business, traveled around. So why was he in Jerusalem? Well, there's pilgrimage. But he might have also been there because he could do some business. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. And ultimately, this might be one of the reasons why he ended up in Rome, because he was a merchant. He traveled around, did business elsewhere, and might have eventually migrated to Rome to conduct business, extend his business. Who knows? Conjecture, conjecture, and more conjecture. But, within the realm of the reasonable. We have to also allow, thirdly, that Simon of Cyrene was in Jerusalem because he had family. He was, after all, Jewish, more than likely, right? There's no reason to doubt that. So he could have had an extended family in Jerusalem. That's not beyond the realm of possibility. So 3 reasons why he could have been in Jerusalem: pilgrimage, business, and family. I think the first one, pilgrimage, is the strongest. Business is quite possible. Family, maybe, maybe not, because he might have had a long family history in the area of Cyrene. Now, when I say all of that, it is probably the case, therefore, that when Simon takes up the cross of Jesus, that was his first real encounter with Jesus. He might have heard of the name before then, but probably knew nothing of him. Remember, much of Jesus's significant ministry was done in Galilee, and as Simon was from Cyrene, he might not have been in Jerusalem that often. The fact that the name of Simon of Cyrene comes down to us is proof that he did not just disappear from history. Think of how the city of Jerusalem would have swelled population-wise with pilgrims at this time of year. If the person who carried the cross was a nobody and remained a nobody, well, nobody would have probably have remembered him. Simon, in and through this event, was exposed to the life and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. How he went from that to become a known person in the church, we will never probably be able to answer definitively. What we can say is that he became a person of faith who quite possibly assumed a position of leadership in the church. This is one more reason to a possible reason why he ended up in Rome to provide leadership to the church. But again, as a business person, he might have traveled there, and because he was a Christian, and he could have assumed what we would consider a lay position of leadership in the early church there. The history of the church in the first generation is largely unknown to us. What we can say is it took people like Simon to reach the world. The church in every age needs those whom we forget to reach out and grow. The church does.